My name is Kamal Rashid. One of the things that Baba to talk about was Kawaida and how Kwanzaa emerges out of Kawaida. For everybody, raise your hand if you've heard of Kawaida before. Kawaida, for those that don't know, was a social theory that was developed in the 1960s merged out of the organization US and the work of Malana Karinga. Kawaida is a Kiswahili word. It literally translates as tradition. And the core idea, the central idea in Kawaida is this, that the core crisis and challenge in black life, in African life, is the cultural crisis and challenge. Again, I'll say it again, that the core crisis and challenge in black life is the cultural crisis and challenge. So Kawaida emerges at a particular point in history where the community was mobilized on a mass scale around social justice, around empowerment. The challenge, however, is that there were competing ideas of what empowerment should look like. From the standpoint of Kawaida, they argued that if we get our minds right, if we can create a particular set of values, a particular set of cultural practices that gives us collectively a clear sense of identity, purpose, and direction, then all the other problems that we seek to address in the movement, those problems will organically work themselves out. They argue that we would organically move to address those problems once we had a clear sense of who we are, what our purpose was in life, and where we're going collectively as a people. And so when Kawaida emerges, one of the core ideas in Kawaida is that we are faced with the challenge of creating an African culture, an African American culture that has the capacity to give us a sense of who we are, a sense of purpose, and also tells us where we're going. And so Kawaida argued that what we have to do is we have to take the best elements of African American culture, the best elements of African culture, the best elements of global culture, and out of that create a dynamic culture for ourselves that gives us a clear sense of where we're going. Part of how Kwanzaa emerges within this is the question becomes, how do you teach, what is the most basic element of culture? If we were to take any culture that exists in the world and strip that culture down to its core basic elements, out of that we would have a particular value system. That value system would be the thing this would be the nucleus of the culture, if you will. It would be the thing out of which every other aspect of the culture emerges. And so that's where the Saba comes from, the 7 principles. The folks in the US organization took the position that if we look at African societies, whether we're talking about the great Oyo Empire, whether we're talking about the ancient Nile Valley civilization, or Kemet, or Nubia, or Aksum, the great Ethiopian kingdoms, or the Zulu Empire, any of these African societies, within those cultures, we would see the 7 basic elements of the Saba: the practice of unity, the practice of self-determination, the practice of collective work and responsibility, the practice of cooperative economics, a sense of collective purpose, an emphasis on creativity and the necessity of creativity for people to solve the most vexing challenges that present themselves, and a sense of abiding faith in their potential, their capacity as a people to address the problems before them. And so the Nguzo Saba comes out of that. But that they concluded that it wasn't enough. It's not enough for us to have a value system. But we also have to do the thing that Kucha Shagalia tells us to do. We have to define reality. Meaning, holidays are part of the process by which people define reality. Any group that has a holiday, their holiday is demonstrative of their power as a group. A holiday, I mean, if you really break the word down, you got holy day. So the holiday is time that's carved out from all other time. And oftentimes, when holidays happen, what happens on holidays? Are the banks open? Grocery stores closed, they close early. People stay home from work or they don't have to go to work. And so the idea of the holiday is to create time that stands outside of the normal demands of our lives, the normal demands of our space. But we take this time and we separate this time so that we can use it to reinforce the particular set of values that the holiday itself engenders. And so part of the idea behind Kwanzaa is it's not enough for us to have this idea of Kawaida. Again, this idea, this system, this process whereby we attempt to refine our culture, to create a culture that propels us into the future. And it's not enough for us to have the value system here in Nguzo Saba, but we also have to take a special time, at least once in the year, when we focus explicitly on those particular principles and use those 7 days as an opportunity to reflect as well as to strategize and problematize in the year ahead. And so Kwanzaa emerges out of an attempt to create a special time, a time that's removed from the normal flow of events that we can use to reflect on our practice of those values over the course of the year, where we can begin to lay plans, not just for the course of the year, but also our plans for the future, so that we can begin to think very concretely about how the practice of these values connects with where we're going as families, as communities, as a nation of people, and as people in the world. And so Kwanzaa emerges very organically and dynamically out of the concerns of people who are in the midst of a movement, out of the concerns of people who are in the midst of solving a cultural crisis. And even though in the 1960s and 1970s, much of that crisis is related to the challenges of inequality, the challenges of segregation, the challenges of police brutality and mass unemployment. But if you think about it, much of that sounds a lot like the crises that we're faced with now. But what we have now, which is even greater than then, is that what like Baba Lumumba said earlier, is we have the crisis of internal lack of cohesion in the community. And so the very bonds of community that allow people to sustain movements in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, to a large extent, those bonds of community have eroded. And so the ongoing importance of Kwanzaa and the ongoing importance of the Saba is for us to take this as a blueprint, as a foundation, and from that begin to create the structures that we can use to repair our community, to heal ourselves. And so, in closing, one of the things that Kawaida continues to compel us to ask ourselves is, as our practice of these principles, does it retain vibrancy in the world? Meaning, does our reflection of the Saba stop at us simply thinking about the principles, or does it also translate into concrete actions and concrete solutions? And when we think about some of the principles, particularly principles like Ujima and principles like Ujamaa, the emphasis inherent in each of those principles, not just those two, but really all seven, but those two in particular, the emphasis is on us transforming space. And so as we think about Ujamaa, the direct implications of Ujamaa is for us to begin to think about how we can transform our communities, and not simply along the lines of creating economic institutions for the sake of a small few attaining profit, but for us to begin to think about how our economic institutions can solve the basic problems of the community. An economy is basically a system for the exchange of goods and services. How profit mechanisms figure into that is another question. And so when we begin to think about our problems, whether it's issues of food security, whether it's issues of housing, whether it's issues of healthcare, whether it's issues of education, whether it's issues of security or transportation, when we begin to think about how we can create structures to solve those problems, that's cooperative economics. And as we begin to think about how we can project and sustain those kind of solutions into the future, it necessitates that we think about how, when we think about economic growth through the lens of Ujamaa, we think about how we can maximize the benefits of those economic enterprises for all in the community, as opposed to a small elite few. And so the emphasis in Kwanzaa and the emphasis within the practice of the Nguzo Saba is not simply on the ideas, but on the doing. And so this 7 days of Kwanzaa, coming out of the principle of Kawaida and coming out of the movement in response to the crisis that we faced then and we face today, is for us to take these principles and think very concretely and coherently about how we can take these ideas and bring them, concretize them in the world, and for the sake of transforming our condition and ensuring that our future is one consistent with our image, consistent with our traditional greatness as a people. Asante San. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. Thank you.